Hey everybody! How's it going out there? Well, I gotta talk about a documentary that came out today because I like myself some nonfiction. You like yourself some nonfiction. That's why you're here. Because you like seeing a person talk about nonfiction things in a sort of format that's kind of strange of a person talking into a camera. You are a strange individual, but we're all strange individuals in our own way. So let's talk about documentaries. So, documentaries are not a new thing to the fandom. I've covered some of them. Some documentaries cover individuals within the fandom and sort of the life that they led and things like that. Like Ruckus, which came out in 2019, covered a particular artist and the person that they met along the way before they unfortunately committed suicide. And it sort of goes over their life and sort of basically it was sort of a perspective of a furry fandom from, a particular furry, right? And, sort of a coming of age sort of story. It was very interesting. It had a good book ending. It was kind of weird in its own little way, but I kind of liked it as a documentary. There was other ones like Fursanas, which, kind of started off as a sort of a broad idea of trying to get a broad scope of the furry fandom, but ended up in its second half being more like showing like how community can become sort of like political, right? So it shows how politics sort of evolves into a community. And the documentary person certainly took a side in their political belief system. Basically, it became sort of an anti-authority stint particularly against Kage, right? And so that was Fursanas. Now we have The Fandom by Ash Coyote, which came out recently. What's the goal of that particular documentary was to be sort of a look back at the furry fandom history, from its earliest days and sort of how it evolved into what it is today. How it did that mostly was through coverage of convention spaces. Particularly 3 conventions were covered in this documentary. Anthrocon, Denver, and Conference, which is no longer a convention, but was the first furry convention. And so Conference was sort of the big thread. It was sort of the big talk discussion for most of the film. Was seeing those Rod and Mark's like growth from from finding this sort of interest in anthro characters to developing their own convention and sort of the trials and tribulations that come along the way, and ultimately to the convention's demise. Anthrocon sort of covers the growth of the East Coast Furry Convention, but also sort of one that sort of mastered the convention space. It wasn't the first, but it sort of did tailor itself to growing as a business and getting its foot on the ground and becoming like basically loved by the city that it's in. So basically sort of a success story. And then sort of Denver I think was covered mostly because I think it was the local convention to Ash Coyote. I think that's mostly why this one was the third one that was picked up. But it was interesting to see their perspective since Denver, was sort of a recovering convention due to the Rocky Mountain Fur Con finding, which was the convention that was sort of in that area before, finding itself in a bit of a pickle due to sort of political aggression by a group within the thing trying to, take the wheel of the convention and sort of doing damage and inflicting damage upon the convention itself so that the convention could no longer function properly. So they had to basically restart from scratch. So basically those 3 conventions were the main things that were covered in that. It had a lot of little interesting tidbits. Some of them I didn't even know. Like there's a a fur who goes by the name of Ken, and who has a cougar character, and this cougar character who is a furry who is a person of color, apparently was the first fursona. And it's one of those things. The kind of cool thing about history is that you learn new things all the time, even on things that you thought you knew everything about, right? And it's like, it's not really something that comes to my mind. It's like you take for granted the concept of fursonas, and you don't really think about like, oh, someone must have created the concept or the idea of the fursona. And it's great to hear that it's like it was a person of color who developed that, right? That it was a gentleman who created this whole thing, and that the first furry convention was founded by a gay couple, and a lot of people would say, well, why is that such a big factor? Why is that such a great thing? There might be some people who's like, it shouldn't matter what race or what sexuality somebody is in order to be proud of a certain event. The reason that it is something to find pride in is not necessarily because that person happens to be an A or a B, but because our community, it means that our community is not held back as much by what I would call systemic limitations. And the concept of systemic limitation isn't really something, it's sort of a phrase I kind of came up with on the spot, so I'll kind of have to describe it a little bit of what I mean by systemic limitation. Basically, the concept is if a society is limiting individuals because of their color, creed, sexuality, ethnicity, such things, right? If a society is holding back individuals based on those things and putting them into second-class status and holding back those individuals' potential, then it causes what's called a systemic limitation. An excellent example of this is if you've ever watched the movie Zootopia. This is something interesting I thought about one of the characters in that movie, and that is Clawhauser. Now, Clawhauser isn't a big character in the film. They're sort of a side character. And a lot of people think of him as the adorable, fluffy, like, cougar character, right? Or not cougar, cheetah. He's a cheetah. He's a cheetah character, and he's adorable, and he's fluffy, right? And he's a little portly. He likes donuts and things. And he's sort of treated as a comedy character, but when I look at the character and what it represents, it's got a kind of big tragedy behind it. And it sort of brings light to sort of the interactions between him and Judy Hopps at the beginning of the film. And what I mean by that is, bunnies are known for their speed, right? But they're a prey animal. Cheetahs are also known for their speed, but they're a predator animal. And in the world of Zootopia, dietism is sort of a thing that exists, where predators are treated as second-class citizens to prey. So here comes Judy Hopps, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, hopping into the PD, and like, I'm going to change the world. And Clawhauser sees her coming in, and he knows like that there's rumors going around that Judy Hopps is like this character that had did well at the academy and has a bright future ahead of her, and she's a little like she's got like this bounce in her step and things like that. And when you think about systemic limitation, you think about, did Clawhauser come into the PD, like the police department, thinking the same thing, right? Thinking that with the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, maybe he was a little thinner, maybe he was a little more lithe, like cheetahs usually are. They're pretty lithe animals. They're quick. They have a lot of muscle. They don't have a lot of fat, right? They're lean, running machines. Maybe a Clawhauser, when he first arrived at the PD, was that way. That he was like, I'm known for my speed. I'm going to be taking care of criminals, right? And maybe he was let out on a few patrols. But maybe he was a little too, maybe he wasn't dealing with the predators in a heavy-handed way, right? Maybe he was one of the good ones, right? One of the good cops. And maybe his character was, not treating, predator animals like second-class citizens, despite how his prey counterparts were acting, right? And so his prey partners were like, you can't trust this guy in the field, right? Because he's not going to take decisive actions when he needs to. So what ends up happening is that dream that Clawhauser had to be a cop like Judy Hopps, right, gets regulated to the front desk, right? And he's like, okay, maybe this is a temporary thing, you know. I'll try to do the best I can with it. But the days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into years. And he's still manning the front desk. And he feels bouts of depression. And in those bouts of depression, he's like, well, if I'm not going to be used for my speed, I'm going to start scarfing donuts, right? And you can sort of see this character develop in the back of your head because the society that he wanted to be something in society, but society didn't let him be that way. So he's like, I'm just going to let it go. I'm just going to let myself go. I'm going to scarf donuts. If I'm not going to have my talents of speed, you know, and agility used, I'm just going to let it all go. So that to me, and it's like, I don't think that was what Clawhauser was meant to. It's probably just a thing in my head, right? It's probably a backstory that I gave Clawhauser. But it makes a lot of sense if you're talking about systemic issues in society where biases can lead to limitations of one's potential. So it is important that you don't limit people's potential for who they are. And I think the furry fandom has succeeded in ways that the rest of society really hasn't. Doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we're perfect. One of the more interesting stories, I really wish I knew about the Fursanas thing being developed by a person of color. Back, like, I think it was Anthrocon 2019. I think it literally was the last year of Anthrocon that I went to. There were some, persons of color who came into the Weston lobby. Because I think that the African American Culture Center across the street was, having sort of a get together as well, and they I was sitting in the lobby and at the front thing, and this group of three persons of color. It looked like they were part of some sort of show or something. I couldn't tell. They didn't have cameras or anything, but they were genuinely curious, right? And they came up and said, "Hey, what's all this about?" And so we kind of went through, it kind of went through the whole gym. It's like, in my mind, I'm like going, you found the right person. I do this all the time. So, but like, certain questions came up and things like that, and it was basic answers and things about like, and like I said, well, there are people who are persons of color in this community that are very well known. He's like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that. Like it looks mostly white. And I said, yeah, its demographics are sort of similar to most of America. There are more black people than a lot of people think there are, and we do treat people of color with respect. And then, but just like normal society, there are certain furries that who are white who don't treat persons of color really well, right? It's like we deal with our own struggles, and at that point, I said I kind of gave the example of the political issues that the fandom dealt with in Colorado and things like that, and how that sort of disagreement on treatment of people and on behaviors, right, sort of led to, that sort of conflict, which led to that, convention's cancellation. So I said it's like it's not immune to politics, right? Furry is not immune to politics. We try to do better as a group, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're perfect. Every group has things that they can do better. And sometimes I think we don't take pride in the successes that we have sometimes, and I think sometimes we get too so one of the critiques that I've seen on the right, because I did write a review for this on Flera, and some of the feedback was there's two main negative feedbacks that I've heard for the fandom thing so far. Number one is I heard about it's too American centric. To that response, I would say, well, the person who's making it lives in America, and they have a limited budget, right? And because they had a limited budget, they can't travel to exotic places or places outside of that, because traveling to Europe is expensive, right? Flying a plane across the Atlantic is pretty expensive. And for me, like, if I'm covering the furry fandom, obviously I'm going to be stronger suited to talk about America as a political system than Europe, right? Because I don't have, like, I haven't lived, like, it's easier to talk about a place when you've lived there a long time. I wouldn't be able to talk about the European furry community all that well, which is why I always encourage people who are part of a community to tell their own stories, and to present their own stories going forward. Unfortunately, when you give a documentary the title of The Fandom, you know, people expect the omnibus of everything that the fandom is. But the reality is that you only have an hour and a half to cover everything, right? So you have to be focused on what your story wants to be. And sometimes, like in the movie, you could see like she wanted to, talk about the artists, and she wanted to talk about the community, she wanted to talk about personas. Those were kind of smattered here and there. The big theme of the film was furry conventions and furry gatherings, right? To me, I think those were the main threads. That was the main big thing of the story. And, you know, the art and things like that were smattered here and there, but it was not like the main meat of the project. I think that she covered some of that stuff better in some other things. One of the big strengths of the film was that everybody who was being communicated with was not in fursuit, which I think was a big thing because it humanizes that. Ironically, coming from somebody who's always spoken in fursuit on his channel, I think that, you know, her doing the interviews and all the interviews outside of fursuit really helped emphasize that it is a community of human beings and not a community of just mascot people who look so adorable and cute, but also, you know, this does dehumanize us, and that's sometimes why it's so easy for people to be, you know, dehumanizing in their words toward us because, hey, we're dressed up as animal people, right? So it's easy to not to go, oh, this person's a human being that I should be treating very well. So, you know, que sera, sera. The reality is that you can't focus too much on what a documentary is not. You have to define what the documentary is. The documentary of The Fandom is a look back at the history of the furry fandom's growth, particularly in the United States of America. If there is a story to be told about furry fandom's growth everywhere. Furry fandom is growing everywhere, in every corner of the world. New Zealand, Australia, you know, China's got a few now conventions. You know, it's you know, there's some in Russia. There's some in Russia, but don't tell the Kremlin, right? Shh, shh. Their furries are all straight furries, okay? Okay? No one tell anyone otherwise. They're all straight furries. They don't have those American quirks. But yeah, so you even had Ukraine, like a Ukraine convention, which is interesting because they had to cancel because of COVID this year, but they had to cancel last year because of the whole, you know, political situation where they had like basically war, right? Like basically like, you know, Russian infiltration and like trying to deal with that kind of situation and dealing with that sort of civil situation, you know, you couldn't make a furry convention stick, right? So they had to cancel 2019 because of that. You know, we have people everywhere, right? All around the world, and us, myself or Ash ain't going to be able to cover the stories of people in those areas as well as they could themselves. I mean, you have Easy Wolf over there in Europe, guys. He's very good at cinematography. I mean, if you guys wanted to create a documentary about the European furry scene, you certainly could do it. Obviously not right now. I mean, I don't know. Europe, I think, is recovering okay. Not us, though. Maybe you're going to have to make more furry conventions over there, guys, because you certainly might not be able to come to America for a year or two. Thanks. Thanks, government. Hashtag thanks, Trump. Anyways, so, but basically that was one critique. The other critique was there was anger that there wasn't enough person of color representation. There was a few artists. Like I think mostly the artists. Like there was a few artists that were black in the film. Which, by the way, this is not the first time that lack of person of color representation has been criticized in documentary media. In Flera, Kate, I think her name's Cassidy Sabat. That person who was on the Eurovision, right? That Eurovision video, the little K-sit person with the gray fur. She basically wrote an article, and her article basically had that criticism at Lisa Ling of CNN for not really having person of color representation in her her little documentary episode of This Is Life, and that episode was really, really well received, and it mostly had the angle of like that furry fandom is used as a outlet for dealing with abuses, right? As sort of a coping mechanism for an unsavory world. That was sort of the angle that her thing took. So her, like Lisa Ling's, was very personal and like had different like people, right? They interviewed different people. You got to know those people, and yeah, all those people were basically white. Like Lisa Ling's was very, like, I didn't recall a person of color at all, unlike with, Ash Coyote's, where she did include, a few people. The reality is that, like, my opinion on that was very, I called it a very spicy take at the time when I did the Lisa response. But it got a lot of good votes, even though it was spicy. So my statement is that when if a complaint is that there's lack of persons of color involved in the documentary, it's sort of a quasi compliment, because the reality is that there was a lot of media coverage of the furry fandom early on, and no person of color complained about not being included. Okay, so like no person of color I've ever heard goes, that Sex 2K thing, yeah, I wanted to be a part of that. Why didn't you guys bring me on board, right? Oh, man show. Why didn't you contact me? I'm a furry, I'm a person of color. You just want white furries or something, right? Or like Tyra Banks, right? No person of color complained about not going on the Tyra Banks show. They were more like, you know what, you fucks, you can have at it. It's all yours. You can take that and have it, right? It's sort of like the media representation is improving, and now that the media representation is improving, persons of colors are starting to come out of the shadows and go, hey, you know what? It's like I feel comfortable in getting involved. And the reason that persons of color would be far more hesitant, right, to get out there and put themselves out there is because, whether you want to believe it or not, being a person of color comes with a lot of risks in a society where, racial bias can be a thing, right? It's like, you can't fire somebody for their race, but you can fire somebody for some tangential reason, right? Like there's this kind of concept when you're gay or black or anything like that. If you were a minority, where you kind of watch your back, right? You kind of have to feel that way, right? Because you're familiar with the history, right? You're familiar with the history and biases that people have, and yeah, there are people in power that have those biases, and those are the worst kinds, right? The people who have power that can use their biases against you. So you have to be very concerned about putting yourself out there, right? Like, it's like, I heard you're part of this furry thing, right? I heard that those furry thing, that furry thing, I heard that they're deviants, and I heard that, they're grooming kids and stuff. They'll selectively sin slam, basically. Because people who groom children are unfortunately in all walks of life. There are predators out there in all walks of life who do a bunch of other different things. we're dealing with that with, Epstein, with the whole, Jeffrey Epstein fallout right now. And we're about to find out, like, a lot of politicians and a lot of people in Hollywood and a lot of people in business, well-off people who might have, these connections with people who, did unsavory things. But people are not very quick to yeet all the people who are rich and powered, right? Some people might wish to, but it's really like people will find excuses for those other rich people that, they couldn't have known and all that stuff. But the thing is, like, any community's like that, right? There are people in the Catholic Church who probably didn't know about the bad things going on. There are people in the furry fandom. We're not omnibus. We're not a hive mind. We can't control everything that everyone does. But we should discuss behaviors that are bad, so that way people are not like wool over the eyes. They're well aware of some of the dangers that are out there so that they can take steps. But unfortunately, some people will use those dangers in order to satisfy a political agenda if that person's an outsider group. Which is why a lot of persons of color are very hesitant and very, gun shy. More so than regular furries. I mean, us regular furries are gun shy. Heck, I have always had my fursuit on whenever I'm on camera. And I'm a white guy, right? You can only imagine if I had, I had another factor of being a minority in a country, that has historical issues with treating people, better, and it's still very much a work in progress. You can imagine how gun-shy I would be at that point, right? As much as I talk on camera, I'm not very much a person who likes to take the spotlight. I'm very much a person who likes to see things as they grow, which is why I talk about other events in the fandom rather than myself. I try not to make myself the story. I tell the story. So, basically, the reality is that, you can empathize, right? That seeing how bad the media has treated furries in the past, that if you're a person of color, you're very hesitant about the media, even more so than probably a white furry is. So, you take opportunities, you take risks, and, sometimes those things pan out, sometimes they don't. Despite this, Ash Coyote has said that she wants to try to do some videos about people of color in the fandom and their experiences. I would also argue that, persons of color can tell their stories better than we can. They don't need, we don't need us white heroes coming in and going, I'm going to tell the story about, this, that, and the other black community. They have the they have means, they have creativity, they have the capacity and the compassion to tell their own stories. And for us, the best thing we can do is to support them and to listen to them as they tell their stories. To me, I think that's the better way of going about it. I cannot talk about the person of color experience. I can only talk about my own experience as a white person, right? So, I don't have that issue. I will say though that here's my weird take on being a white person and how I can empathize a lot with people of color. I grew up in I consider primary education schools as sort of a vault, right? They're like the vaults of Fallout 76. They're the tutorial level. You put yourself in those vaults, you gain experiences, and you learn things. And before you are pushed out into the world, and you try to use those experiences to help shape the world in a better way, or to, at least help yourself get into a good career and things like that. But obviously, the vaults have different ideas and priorities in mind. So, interestingly enough, a lot of people who I learned in college that a lot of schools out there who are for persons of color sometimes don't get as much funding as white people as primary schools that are have primarily white people, right? Interestingly enough, when I grew up though, just recently, I learned what Juneteenth was, which I didn't know what Juneteenth was. I wasn't taught that in primary school, and I wasn't even taught what Juneteenth was in college. I wasn't even aware of the day's existence, basically. And it just kind of showed me, it's So they spent all this money on education, and I didn't even know what that was, right? You know, it's kind of like you have all this money and resources, but your teachers sort of misinform you or give you like sort of a rose-tinted view of the world, right? Whereas in other, like in more the urban, like the more downtrodden schools, like you don't have the resources, but you learn very quickly about being scrappy and how sort of to, you know, to use the elements and stuff like that. It shouldn't be that way. Like, we should have schools that teach us good, right? But we don't. Like, we either have schools that have a lot of money but not a lot of, you know, but, you know, don't teach us the hard facts about life, and or, you know, you have people who have too much hard times and don't have the resources, right? So you gotta strike that balance, and I think that needs to be done better. The thing though is that here's the thing about my Volt. My Volt was basically, I would say, the white supremacist wet dream, right? That it was like 97.5% white kids in my class. And from what I can tell you is that wet dream of theirs is a nightmare. It honestly is. Like, I have lived the white supremacist wet dream. I've lived in a school for like, you know, a decade and a half of my life. Like, I've been in a primary school where I was treated like crap. So when like the big lie that like white supremacists tell you, it's like, well, if we just got rid of all the other races, our world would be more harmonious. And it's like, that's bullshit. Like, I lived your wet dream. That's bullshit. Sorry, there's no other word for it. I lived that life. I lived in your racial pure society. You will find other things to treat people as an outsider. You will find other reasons to bully people. That is the truth. That is the cold hard facts. Because when there's no other enemies to deal with, you'll turn the crap inward. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. My experiences throughout life has taught me that. And that ain't nothing that you can learn from a book. So that's why I'm like, even despite the paleness of my skin, I very much am adamantly against that philosophy of life, right? Where they say that, you know, of that concept of racial purity and that concept of that if there was only one race, then everything would be better. It won't. Because that whole concept of, you know, lost potential, right? There are brilliant people out there who are different races, color, creeds, who will bring things to the table, who will bring things together in the community, and bringing those things together in the community, you know, make things better, make things more, like, make things cooler, make things, like, being much more expressive. Thanks to, you know, a person of color back in the 80s who made this Fursanas thing. Like, I can have a kangaroo character and sit here on this couch and share my stories with you. Without the efforts of that person of color, that Fursana wouldn't exist as it does today, right? The concept of a Fursana wouldn't exist as it does today. I wouldn't be able to go out to furry conventions, right? If that gay couple didn't have the gumption to go, you know what? Our hobby's weird, it's strange, but we're gonna put ourselves out there anyway. We're gonna get our community together. We're gonna have a good time, and we're gonna be a little freewheeling about it, you know. And you know, we're gonna have to learn how to put restraints on things and how to work within the society. But they took the first steps, right? So likewise, it teaches us, and it teaches myself, and it teaches everybody that, you know, you have to kind of go for your goals, right? Despite what society is, despite the headwinds that society puts in your way, to conform to a certain way, to conform to a comfortable sort of way, that you face it headlong, you move forward, and through that trials and tribulations, you'll come out stronger, a community will come out stronger, and, you know, things will be better. I mean, a person of color made peanut butter, right? Peanut butter. Like, that's probably more important to me than freaking the Versanis thing. Sorry, no offense, Tail. No offense. But, like, I live off of peanut butter, man. Like, if peanut butter didn't exist, I'd be like, what am I going to put on my sandwich? I've got bread and Vegemite. Oh, no, not Vegemite. You're a kangaroo. You should like Vegemite. No Vegemite. Give me peanut butter. No Vegemite. So what are you, an elephant? No, I'm a kangaroo. But peanut butter is great. It's the perfect condiment for a sandwich. It just gets the breads to stick together, and it's got that peanut buttery taste. I know everyone is sad that I don't like Vegemite, but anyways, what I'm saying is that, you know, if you have a story to tell, if you feel like that the full story of the fandom wasn't told by the fandom, the best thing that you can do is to create your own story, to come up with a plan to share your stories with the world. Every one of us has a video camera that can do it. I do. You're watching a video that I did right now, sort of a little off the cuff, but, you know, very low production value, okay? Not very edited, but that's the whole thing. I'm trying to get used to speaking in real time and trying to make it so that I can speak in a charismatic way in the real time. That's always been sort of a goal of this channel, a side goal for myself. But also to present information, right? In sort of a cordial way. So, if you have a goal in mind, if you have a story that you want to share, share it. Share your story. Don't worry too much about trying to appease everyone with your story, right? You can't please everybody. You have a limited amount of time. You can cover a subsection of the things that you're passionate about, right? Because if there are people in the, you know, the person of color community that really want to show and highlight, you know, individuals of color within the fandom and make them stronger and make them greater leaders, that's awesome, because that means less lost potential, right? Because if somebody's, you know, intimidated for who they are and they're worried about what other people will think, you know, that's lost potential, right? So I would rather people be comfortable and come forward with their stories. I would rather that be a thing, right? You know, even if it's, it's like, here's the thing. You don't have to be included in everything within the community. Let me say that again. You don't have to be involved in everything in the community. That's the one big thing about me as a nonfiction writer and as a nonfiction thing. I don't create events. I record them. That is my job. It's not my job to go out there and create events. It's my job to record events within the community, in whatever direction the community wants to go, right? It's not my job to control or curate the community, right? That's not my job. That's never been my job. And that's the difference between a journalist and a pundit. A pundit will try to direct society in which direction it's going, or direct a community in which direction it's going, based upon their own beliefs or ideologies. A journalist is somebody who records the direction that people are going, so that people who look back can go, you know, this is how things sort of derived. This is how things sort of changed over time. This is how people's conversations changed over time. And to do that, you have to be engaged in the politic, right? You do have to, and as a human being myself who has a life that they want to live, obviously there's certain politics that I would like to see in my life and have around my life than others. As I said, I don't believe in the whole white supremacy thing, and I gave you the reason why I don't, right? And why I would never support that particular aspect, right? I have a very solid reason, a very solid foundation as to why I believe that that is definitely not the direction that society should go, right? But that's the whole thing. Everyone has their own story to share. They can share it better than that, right? See, a person of color wouldn't have been able to tell you, like, about the story about a white kid growing up in a mostly white school and then coming to the conclusion that white supremacy is bad because their white colleagues were a jerk to them, right? That's something that's only my experience. That's my own experience. Which is why, and I can't speak to their experience. So to me, instead of worrying about having instead of worrying about having a documentarian or a journalist, instead of worrying about being the representative of everyone, simply gives the people the courage, the conviction to come forward and talk about their own stories using their own words, using their own writing, helping them write their own stories, helping them share their own stories. That is the important part. So, that's all I have to say about that as far as the fandom goes. You can show your support. I put a card up there towards the free YouTube video is the Fandom's documentary. I put it at the beginning of the video. There is links in that to buy and support that things. And I look forward to more nonfiction being a thing in the fandom. Thank you very much for watching this ramble about an hour video about the furry fandom for about 45 minutes, I think this was. Ironically, so you could have watched. See, that's that I have to give props to for the documentaries is the editing and condensing of information in a short space, because I had I had not as much information and it's spread out over a longer period of time. But some people like to watch this whole thing for some reason. I don't know why. Some people like that kind of content, and I thank you those fans who stuck around for this whole thing. But anyways, I'll see you guys on the next video to talk about the next thing. I keep misclicking that part. It's silly. Anyways, there's the card. Have a good one, guys. Getting the hop out of here.